what to expect this year in trucking mobility, as well as whether we are able to see some growth in some of these areas like electrification. We'll get to that in a minute, but first, a few headlines. It's another day, and we have yet another building block announcement from Nikola on its fuel cell and hydrogen ambitions. They're actually going to make more news later today after our show, but for now, they're announcing that 15 of the fuel cell trucks that you see there are going to be delivered to Biagi Brothers in the fourth quarter this year. Now, the fuel cell, hydrogen fuel cell truck at Nikola is the second product, following the very similar battery electric tray truck that they started production on last year and have been doing some deliveries of. This is on target for them in terms of what they said they would be able to do. They're also working very closely now to try to get something happening on the hydrogen production side. They've got a hydrogen hub that they've announced in Arizona. They also have some stations in California. We'll see how all this plays out. But one of the things to watch for, of course, is going to be just how expensive will these trucks be. Nikola has said that because of California incentives and the Inflation Reduction Act incentives, that these trucks could go for 40 to 70% less than sticker in terms of a purchase price once those incentives are figured in. So count on incentives being a big part of this. Nikola also has announced yesterday a deal, or at least an intent, with, let me say this right, it's Fortescue, which is a maker of green hydrogen being zero-emission hydrogen that doesn't come from natural gas, in terms of kind of a way to come up with a fuel that will allow them to do it with zero emissions, just like they've planned all along. A lot of the hydrogen today does have a carbon footprint because, like I say, it comes off of natural gas, so-called gray hydrogen. But getting to green hydrogen is the goal, and this is just the latest announcement they've made. Also interesting, coming out of yesterday's announcement at PACCAR of their really blockbuster earnings in the fourth quarter, was some commentary on the call with with CEO Preston Fate and his executive team about electric trucks. PACCAR, which is the parent of Peterbilt and Kenworth, as well as DAF Trucks in Europe, has made it pretty clear that they think clean diesel will continue to be the fuel of the near future for trucking, maybe even the midterm. They're into electric trucks. They have 9 different models available at this point, but they think that the sales are going to be in the hundreds of trucks per year for a while. It's not going to be something that is really going to take off. Now, what was interesting, it was kind of just sort of a comment that came up yesterday about fuel cell trucks, that they were asked about continuing some work that they've done with Toyota on fuel cells. And the original trucks that you see here were put into the ports of Los Angeles, basically with 2 Toyota Mirai passenger car fuel cell stacks lashed together to run the trucks. They did a good job. They've now been pretty much taken out of service. There's a second version coming. But the thing that you should be watching for now is Toyota is building a heavy-duty fuel cell stack in Kentucky starting this year. Watch and see if PACCAR isn't one of the first customers for that. Okay, so let's bring on Sam Abuelsamid. Sam, I've been saying your name wrong all these years. You never once corrected me. So I thank you for that. We're going to get it right from now on. I promise you that. But great to have you here, Sam. We've been working together off and on over the years back at General Motors, and you've been a regular person in terms of helping us get some of these stories posted with some real good perspective that you bring, and really glad to have you here.
Glad to be with you today, Alan.
Yeah, well, listen, it's just going to be 2 of us. We were hoping to have Antti Lindstrom from S&P Global, but something apparently happened, so we're just going to take up all the time, you and me, buddy.
That's probably stuck in the snow somewhere.
And that's okay, because what's that?
I said he's probably stuck in the snow somewhere.
He could be. He lives out in Colorado, so there's a good bit of that. A good bit of that. We have it here today in Michigan as well, as I think you know. Listen, I wanted to ask you before we get started, though, Sam. You've been around. Give us a little background on. I mean, you have a fascinating background in your own right, and I'd like you to maybe just tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm an engineer by training. I graduated with a mechanical engineering degree in 1990, spent 17 years in the auto industry, working as a product development engineer, then transitioned to being a full-time journalist for a number of years. Then did a stint on the dark side, working in communications with you. And then from there, I transitioned about 8.5 years ago to being a industry technology analyst with what was then Navigant Research, now Guidehouse Insights, covering emerging technologies in the transportation sector, including automated driving, alternative fuels like fuel cells, electrification, natural gas, and so on, connected vehicles, mobility services, you name it, pretty much everything that's interesting in transportation.
Well, and I think the perspective that you bring is that you are an engineer, which means you can geek out, I guess, with the best of them. But that's not really what I've noticed you being able to do. I've noticed that when we've called you, and you are one of the first calls on some of these stories for perspective, what we find out is that you're able to put it in pretty simple layman terms, and that's what makes, quite honestly, you very appealing, because you talk like a regular person, but I think your knowledge is way deeper. I've been at events with you where you get pretty deep into stuff, and it's like, oh, I got to wait for him to come back. But
I think
anyway,
that's one of the things I really try to do is try to translate engineering language into something that the rest of the world can understand.
well, you do a good job of it. I'll tell you that. And you know, we've been around each other for a long time. So I asked you before you came on today to send me some predictions for the year for what you see coming. And I know that you operate both in the car or passenger car and truck world. But I wanted to, well, actually, before we get to the predictions, I want to ask you about something that you wrote recently and sort of get an update on that. You put out some predictions around sort of the leaders, I think, is the best way to think of it in Class 8 truck autonomy. You listed Waymo, Aurora, and Too Simple. Why don't you give us a little update on where you see that now?
Yeah, so these leaderboard reports are something that we do at Guidehouse from time to time on a variety of different technology areas. And this past year, we published our first leaderboard on the autonomous trucking space. And what we do when we're looking at that is we try to take a holistic view of which companies are most likely to succeed in whichever sector we're taking a look at. And so we're looking at their technology, their partners, their go-to-market strategy, the whole spectrum of what they're doing, rather than just one single piece of it, to try to gauge how ready they are to commercialize the technology. Obviously, at the time when I wrote that report and we published that was before a lot of rather negative news about Too Simple came out, which the thing about our leaderboards, they're always a snapshot in time of the information that's available at that time, and so. If I had written that a few months later, probably would have had a slightly different result. I think Too Simple probably wouldn't have been quite up as high on that list. We learned of some challenges they were having with their operations in China and the end of their partnership with Navistar to develop a truck platform to incorporate their automated driving technology on, as well as some other issues that they were having.
Yeah, lots of boardroom drama, which we wrote about. We don't need to get into that here. I am curious, though, from a technology standpoint, on Too Simple, if you still see them in that sort of survivor group, thriver group, whatever you want to call it. And do you see? I know you've told me before that you really feel companies need to have a partnership or at least an entree into an OEM to be successful. All of the three that were in your snapshot did at the time, and two of them still do. But we've got some other companies. We seem to be writing a lot about Kodiak Robotics these days because they continue to do interesting things, but they don't have an OEM partner per se. Does that limit them in some way, Sam?
I think Kodiak is doing some really interesting things. Their approach with their design of having essentially what they call a sensor pod. So having the entire mirror assembly, the outside mirror assembly, integrated with all of the sensors in that mirror assembly, and being able designing it so that can be attached to the vehicle. And then if it needs to be serviced, if there's a problem with one or more of the sensors, they can remove that entire pod, put on another one, and then service that sensor pod offline while the vehicle gets back into service fairly quickly. And I think that's a really interesting approach. It still requires a degree of integration with the vehicle, though, because you still have to install the compute platform in there somewhere inside the vehicle. You have to integrate all that with the actuators for the powertrain, the braking system, the steering, and so even though they've got a very interesting solution for the sensing component. There's still a level of hardware integration that's required that I think the types of partnerships that Waymo and PACCAR and previously Too Simple had with OEMs to develop a version of the vehicle that basically makes it plug and play to install the automated driving system, makes it a lot easier to implement that. And then when a customer decides that they want a vehicle with one of these automated driving systems on it, they can just go to their OEM of choice, order that vehicle, and have it line fit with all that equipment on there, so that it doesn't have to be retrofitted afterwards.
Right. And do you see the opportunity for, and I want to move into our predictions here pretty soon, but do you see the opportunity then for the Kodiaks, the Embark, some of these guys to be able to sort of come up with a critical mass to sort of get the OEMs to handle their stuff too? I mean, it's definitely one of those things that Don Burnett at Kodak, for example, told me that, he says, I wouldn't presume to tell PACCAR what to do, but I would think that if I brought business to them, they would want to have that business for, their integrated or, redundant chassis. So maybe it's not a hurdle.
I think that longer term, it will probably be less of a hurdle, because one of the things that we're seeing is most of these truck manufacturers are designing versions of their trucks in sort of a generic AV ready form. We first saw this happen in the light duty space several years ago with what was then Fiat Chrysler, after Waymo first went to them to buy a fleet of Pacificas to use for their test fleet. FCA worked with the Waymo engineers to do the hardware integration. They developed a custom version of the wiring harness and a number of other components that they installed on the assembly line where they build the Pacificas, and then they subsequently did a generic version of that and offered to AV companies an AV ready version of that van. Toyota offers a similar thing now with their Sienna minivans, the Sienna Autonomous. And I think truck manufacturers are moving in that same direction. Freightliner, Daimler Truck has, they're developing an AV ready version of their truck that Waymo is going to be using, but also they're using it with their own torque robotics team that is developing their own ADS system that Daimler owns. And I think we'll see other truck OEMs following the same kind of pattern. And if they do that, then I think eventually it'll be possible for customers to choose if they want a Kodiak robotics system, for it to be relatively straightforward to integrate that. But in the near term, they still have to work. They still have to work on modifying the trucks to integrate the Kodiak robotics system in there, or some of the other systems that don't have specific OEM partners.
Sure. Well, that's a great explanation. I think in one sense, we have covered a good part of one of your predictions, and that is that we may see some consolidation. I want to talk more about this, but we may see some consolidation in the automated trucking sector as it moves towards driver out commercial deployments in 2024. I don't think you're out on a limb with that one, but let's hear your thinking.
Yeah, and we've long felt that both across the spectrum from light duty to heavy duty vehicles, that the number of companies that ultimately offer commercialized automated driving systems will reduce dramatically. I mean, it's at one point, we certainly had close to 100 different companies globally. There's fewer now, and there will be fewer still going forward. We've seen a number over the years already go away, go out of business, or get acquired by other companies. We saw, for example, Uber and Lyft get out of that business. Uber basically gave their advanced technologies group to Aurora. Lyft sold off their level 5 group to Toyota. We've seen others get acquired. Starsky Robotics went under a few years back. They were focused on trucking. And so I think we will see some of the players that haven't gained a lot of commercial traction start to fade away, particularly over the next couple of years if we continue to have a tight capital market. Over the last year, it's become much more difficult for these companies to raise new capital, which they need to continue funding their R&D, building out their development fleets, and eventually commercializing. As interest rates have gone up, the stock market's gone down. VCs have become less enamored with the automated driving space than they were a few years ago. They're no longer putting money into this space. So I think some of these companies they're eventually just going to run out of cash, and they're going to have to either sell out or just turn off the lights. So we'll definitely see some of these companies go away.
Yeah, I think we've been writing that now for a while, that consolidation is coming. We're not going to pick winners and losers. You took a whack at that at the start of this segment, but I think in a sense you're absolutely right. There's not a lot of money. One of the people who's very happy that they didn't go public either through SPAC or IPO is, again, Kodiak. They said, when you go that route, when you go public, that should be your last capital raise. And I think what we're finding now is that it's taking some of these companies another swing at the gate to try to get money. That there's some very creative and maybe risky ways that they're doing it. So anyway, you had a couple more predictions on your list. Why don't we take a look at the fuel cells? Because we talked about that at the top of the show. Where are you on fuel cells this year?
I'm still fairly bullish on fuel cells particularly for long haul trucking. I think that there's some really good applications for fuel cell technology. Long haul, batteries still are problematic for long haul trucks. They can work for some applications, but because of the weight of batteries, the cost of batteries, it's challenging to do, for example, cross country routes with battery powered tractors. But fuel cells, if you can build out the infrastructure, and for all the flaws of what happened with Nikola and their launch, their actual strategy that they laid out at the beginning actually made a lot of sense, of gradually building out a network of fueling stations, ideally locations where you've got a lot of traffic, and also where you can hopefully generate the hydrogen on site rather than transporting it to that location. And then building out that network and gradually expanding where those trucks can operate. And the range that's possible, the refueling times that's possible with fuel cell trucks versus even the fastest charging systems, even with a megawatt charging system, it's still going to take you longer, and you're still going to have payload limitations with a battery powered system. Now, for local regional trucking, that's a very different story. their battery powered trucks can work really well, and we're already seeing them being deployed in some applications. And you can have a battery powered truck with 350 miles of range that is very usable for a lot of applications.
Sure. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned. I think that when Nikola started, they said 700 hydrogen stations. They were going to be about $17 million each. They're now down to 60, which seems like maybe a more reasonable number. A lot of activity in the sort of acquiring the hydrogen. We talked about that at the top of the show. But it does seem that they're making the moves, and goodness knows everything gets sometimes a side eye for Nikola because of the problems they've had. But they do seem to be proceeding along the lines of doing what they said. Today they said, 15 trucks are going to Biagi Brothers. That's a bit of a tester out of Napa that they've used for a long time, and they've been driving those trucks since early 2022. So it does seem like as the Chinese phrase "ibu goes, they're making step by step. They're getting closer. So that's interesting. You also have you had one other prediction for us, and it does talk about battery electric. You sort of alluded to it, but why don't you talk about number one on your list there?
Yeah, so I mentioned, growing use of battery electric trucks in those local and regional applications, day cabs, and where they're operating within a range of 250 to 300 miles. I think that in those kinds of applications, very often those trucks don't need to be running 24 hours a day. A lot of times, they will have a longer idle period and some downtime during the course of the day. So those can be reasonably charged, within the use case that they have. And I think that, we're already starting to see some test deployments of those. You've got a number of manufacturers that are offering those types of trucks, certainly in Europe. We're starting to see them here in North America. And I think that we'll see more of those early deployments of those trucks, like the Freightliner e-Cascadias and some of the other options that are out there, Volvos out there. I think we'll see more of those hitting the roads this year and into 2024.
Yeah, I know it was interesting that we didn't write it, but it's interesting that here in Michigan, Meijer, which is a big grocery operation, is using them for cold weather testing, not campus casing kind of cold weather testing, but, just to see what happens to the battery life, in short haul testing. They've had a couple of the e-Cascadias, running that way. And of course, Michigan winters aren't horrible always, but they can be cold and they can be snowy, right? And so, it's interesting that they have that going on, where we see again, with autonomy, you see everything kind of in the southern third of the U.S. because they need the good weather. They're not quite ready. I think Embark did a test run in snow, but the autonomous trucks, quite honestly, have to stick to the south right now because they really can't put up with the changes in weather and so forth. Sam, I want to kind of wrap up with you here on this question, and that is, as you look at the year to come, is this a year where we will see steady progress, big progress, or little progress in all the areas we've been talking about?
Yes. A bit of all of the above.
Open-ended question. There you go. Huh?
Yeah, no, this is typical in engineering. From every once in a while, you have some big progress. You'll have a big step. There's some kind of breakthrough, but it's mostly going to be incremental steps. Gradually moving hopefully in the right direction. So mostly steady progress. Slower in some cases, a little faster in other cases, but moving forward as users, fleet operators, and manufacturers become more comfortable with these various technologies, validate that they can work figure out what use cases they can work in and work best in initially, start getting those out there into the field, start getting some of the benefits of that, whether it's operating costs or meeting sustainability goals or for safety reasons. And then gradually expanding the scope of those use cases to more and more areas.
Sure. Well, good stuff. Good discussion. Sam, thanks so much for coming on. You carried the day for us. I appreciate that. I just tell our audience that Truck Tech will be on the road next week at Manifest in Las Vegas. Join us when our guests will be Mike Placentia from Ryder System and Sam Saad from Gatik. We will talk about how Ryder is integrating with autonomous trucking to take on some of the tasks where the startups really need help. And we'll also have hopefully some news out of Manifest to share at the top of the show. Everyone, thank you very much for being here. Come back. You can watch us on your podcast, your favorite podcast. And thanks for being here. Have a great week.
When guests come to an event like F3, we know what they want is a chance to show off their products, their swag, and make new partnerships that will last until our next FreightWaves event.
But the problem is there are so many industry events, it can be so hard to find the right one to invest your time and energy in. We at FreightWaves take your investment seriously.
Which is why we've brought together thousands of industry professionals in one city over 3 days to showcase all you have to offer.
Because your successful connections at an event like F3 move all of us forward.
Don't believe us?
Join us in June.